Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski, and I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and also director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center this fall quarter. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx communities across the Americas. And today's speaker is a truly leading scholar and administrator in this space. Jairo Lugo-Ocando is professor in residence and director of executive and graduate education at Northwestern University in Qatar, our sister campus in Doha. Valerie Gruest, doctoral student in media technology and society at Northwestern here in Evanston and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Jairo in just a minute. But before we do that, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building partnerships and relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Now back to today's event, let me briefly say how the seminar will unfold. First, Valerie will tell us more about Jairo's research and career in just a few seconds. Then Jairo will deliver his seminar, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at any point in time. Valerie will moderate, will read them aloud, and Jairo will reply. And at the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Valerie, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo. Good afternoon, everyone. And Pablo, thank you so much for having me as a co-moderator for the seminar. It is my absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Originally from Venezuela, Dr. Jairo Lugo-Ocando holds a BA in Media Studies and Journalism with a minor in Politics from Universidad del Zulia in Venezuela, a postgraduate certificate in Public Sector Management from the University of Stirling in the UK, a Master's in Defense and Security Analysis in International Relations from Lancaster University in the UK, and a doctorate in Democracy Development and ICTs from the University of Sussex in the UK. He has worked for more than 2 decades in the field, focusing on the intersection between poverty, social exclusion in the media, journalism and representation of development, humanitarian communication and publication relations, as well as the use of statistics and data by journalists and news media. Before becoming an academic, Dr. Lugo-Ocando worked as a journalist and news editor-in-chief of Venezuela's Diario La Verdad, and worked as a journalist and freelance writer for several news organizations in Venezuela, the United States, Peru, and Colombia. He previously worked as a lecturer and program director of journalism studies in several prestigious universities in the UK, and until 2018, he served as associate professor and deputy head of the School of Media and Communication at the University of Leeds in the UK. He is currently a professor in residence and director of executive and graduate education at Northwestern University in Qatar. Over the years, he has received over $1.1 million in external research grants funding from the United Kingdom's Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Qatar National Research Fund, among other institutions. And additionally, he was a recipient of the Theodore C. Sorensen Fellowship from the John F. Kennedy Library and was a visiting fellow at the National University of Singapore. He's the editor of several books and special issues of journals, acting as a member of editorial boards of the Journal of Applied Journalism and Media Studies, Public Relations Inquiry for Southern Europe and Latin America, and Temas de Comunicación. He is also author of several monographs, journal articles, and book chapters, including Developing News, Global Journalism, and the Coverage of Third World Development, Escuchar para Creer, la radio de servicio público y la Iglesia Católica en Venezuela, Poor Numbers, Poor News, The Ideology of Poverty Statistics in the Media, and Importancia de las relaciones con los públicos en la reputación en un destino turístico inteligente, propuesta de un modelo sostenible, to name just a few. So in addition, his latest book, Foreign Aid and Journalism in the Global South, is coming out in 2020. We are so honored to have Dr. Jairo Lugo-Ocando today to share with us his knowledge and experience. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Valerie and Pablo, for the invitation. And I'm very honored and humbled for being part of this group and the center, which I think is an absolutely marvelous initiative. And I think that all credit to all of you and Pablo especially for this. Normally, I would be much happier if I was face-to-face with all of you, but there's two things about me doing this online. First, that a lot of you might not be able to be here unless it was online. And the second thing is that I'm nice and warm here in Doha and not a little bit cold there in Chicago. So thank you very much all. And I'm just going to start by sharing my screen, and that way you can see the presentation. Yep, and yep, that's it. Hopefully, okay. So first of all, this is a research that I'm doing with my colleague, Jose Luis Requejo Alemán, who I think probably is connected to, and Jose Luis is a professor at the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. He's originally from Peru. And for a couple of years, we've been looking at this topic of digital natives and the way they operate in Latin America. The topic, of course, I'm going to center is the topic of the talk, which is the Twitter use authorial control and agenda setting in Latin America's non-profit investigative journalism organizations. And this is a very important point, that we have centered our research in basically in the non-profit ones, the ones that are sustained through foreign aid. In fact, you know, that is a very important element. The book is actually now out when we were preparing this conference, but the book actually just came out. And one of the things I've been looking in the past few years is about the influence of foreign aid and how foreign aid had shaped journalism, not only in Latin America, but across the global South, and how has permitted a new way of doing journalism in the global South. So, the main research question that Jose Luis and I departed from was to ask ourselves, how do Latin American native nonprofit investigative journalism organizations secure authorial control in terms of agenda setting? Sorry, that number shouldn't be there, but that's the last minute thing that I was. So how do they manage to keep control over the narratives? And that's something that we managed to look at. So I'll in that start, I'll talk a little bit about the methodology that we use, and also then I'm going to present some of the findings. But let me start by quoting Gustavo Orriti. Gustavo Orriti, to me, and of course that's a personal opinion, and probably to Jose Luis also, because we will talk, is the best journalist, the best investigative journalism in Latin America. And he has a very long trajectory. He's somebody who has been the editor of some of the most important newspapers in the region, not only in Peru, but in Panama and other places. And at some point, he got tired of, media conglomerates, corporate interests, and he just became an independent journalist and set up what's today IDL Reporteros, which is today one of the most important digital native organizations in the region. Gustavo, these are two quotes from the interviews. We have interviewed something like 20-something journalists in the region, but this is two quotes from Gustavo Orriti, which we found particularly interesting, insightful. With social media, autocrats may think they can ignore the traditional intermediaries of information, but the best journalists are not just mere messengers. And I thought that was a very important, insightful comment from Gustavo. Gustavo, by the way, was had to confront the period of Fujimori and also Alan Garcia and all the abuses that were committed against journalists and human rights in that time. The second quote that he says is, making visible and defending a journalistic investigation can be more difficult than just conducting the investigation itself in the age of social media. And these were two quotes that he did while we were asking him and others about this topic of making sure that your organization has an impact in the agenda. It can manage the agenda and can control the agenda. So that's the first thing that I will quote here. So a little bit of background in context of the digital natives, and of course, the digital native it's part of the new landscape, media landscape in the region, in Latin America, and as such, they confront a series of challenges that I would say define and shape the way they operate. First, an increasing process of depoliticalization in general of audiences. And, you know, with the exception of places like Venezuela, which are still very highly polarized and political. Latin America, before this, before the pink tide revolution, that brought left-wing governments into power, had become progressively depoliticized. So people were not voting. If you look at people engagement with political parties, they were not registering political membership. So it was a phenomenon that not only, to be fair, was not only of Latin America, but of the whole continent. The second challenge that this digital native-based investigative journalist organizations faced was a fragmentation of media audiences. And, you know, the traditional model of journalism was based on the fact that you could, first of all, attract the attention of a substantial group of the public, and then you commodify that public, you turn it into a commodity, and then you sold it to advertisers. That's the way, you know, the traditional media model worked for more than 100 years. Well, that's no longer possible, in part because, you know, the technological revolution that we have experienced in the past 35 years have meant that people have changed substantially the way they engage with the media. For example, no longer we have a process of socialization with the media. When I grew up, my parents, well, my mother will read the newspaper and watch television, and we will do it at the same time. We will watch television in the living room at the same time. We all grew up with Mafalda, Kino just died, but we all grew up with Mafalda. We all read it. We passed it among brothers, and we read it. And that's no longer the case. You know, everybody's having their own screen and consuming media on their own screen. That means that the fragmentation not only occurs in society horizontally across society, but also vertically inside each family. The other point that the digital native base are confronting at the moment is a huge, I will call it irrational concentration of advertisement investment, where people just advertise in Google, even though there's not really a lot of data that can substantiate claims that Google is more effective than other media, but particularly if you're talking about niche markets of products. So that concentration means that Google, that particularly news media companies like Google or Facebook and even Twitter just hoover the whole advertising investment and take the majority of them, just leaving a few crumbles for the rest of the media. There's also a general decline in the consumption of news, and they don't have, and these organizations don't have strong brands like other organizations they had in the past. So if you were like El Mercurio in Chile, which is a newspaper we have studied a lot, and in the past, you had a very strong brand. That's no longer the case. And the other thing is lack of standardization in regards to what journalism is. Some of these native digital organizations that operate, let's say, YouTube, like Democracy Now! In the US, to give an example, the US has a particular standard of journalism that you don't see, for example, in the Young Turks. I'm just talking about examples that people from the US can relate, but of course, in Latin America, it's similar. Some of these organizations do not have the same type of standards in the way they practice journalism. So when you see, in the past, when you saw ABC News or CBS or BBC News from the UK, you could see some standard, you knew that was news. Today, some of these native organizations, the way they present the stories, it doesn't comply with the traditional standards that we saw in the past. So in face of this context, I would say it is very difficult for many of these organizations to sustain themselves from themselves. It will be very difficult to sustain themselves, financially speaking, for themselves. So to think about, at least in a market like Latin America, where even traditional media struggle for many years, and we know that newspapers, I worked in newspapers as a young fellow, in which I knew the newspaper lost money for 10 years. But the owner kept that newspaper because it gave him political leverage with the local government to get, I don't know, whatever contracts or whatever he did, or political power. And so a market that in itself, the Latin American market, has been historically weak for news organizations, it's even weaker in the age of the digital native media. So this media basically depends this media basically depends on, in a lot of cases, on foreign aid. So, and that foreign aid is fundamental in the assignments they do. I'm just going to go back to one slide because I didn't really comment on this, but these are two of the most famous cases that the digital native media has brought into the public eye. The case of the Lava Juez, that was in Peru, very famous case, and some say provoked at the end even suicides of politicians, etc. And the other case is the Panama Papers. Now, I'm going to make an affirmation that some people might not agree, and I'm going to make it because it's provocative, but also because I think it's absolutely true. Without foreign aid, there would be no investigative journalism, or there would be very little investigative journalism in Latin America. And I'm absolutely convinced of that. Now, people know in Europe and the United States about the case of the Panama Papers, and what people sometimes did not recognize is that when the Pulitzer Prize was awarded, it was awarded to something like 112, 115 media organizations, news organizations that were part of that research project. But a huge proportion of those organizations were Latin American digital native organizations. Without foreign aid, the Panama Papers probably, very likely, would not have happened, because a lot of the groundwork for that research was not done by the Spiegel in Germany or by the New York Times. They reproduced this, but it was the Latin American journalists who actually got a lot of the access and a lot of the follow-up to that investigation, and also to other investigations like Overage and others. So what we're looking here in our research question is about how this digital media operates, and how they visualize themselves, how they make themselves visible, because they do compete with the traditional media in terms of capturing the imagination of the audiences and also in setting the agenda. For many years, the digital native were in the back. The traditional media kept at the forefront of establishing the media agenda, but these people did, the native digital did a lot of the research of the investigative reporting that was carried out. So we analyze the use of Twitter because we, in our theoretical explanatory theoretical framework, we assume that that social media has been key for these organizations to level the playing field and to participate more actively and more effectively in setting a news agenda and influencing the news agenda in their own countries. We adopted a quantitative approach that included the analysis of which was actually more than 10 non-profit investigative journalism. And we have triangulated information with that included not only other quantitative methods like ethnographic observations, but also semi-structured interviews. And this was all part of a paper. We've published the first one a couple of years ago. We're now preparing 2 more. And actually, this is because of Pablo. Pablo was the one who originally invited us to a special edition. We failed Pablo. We were not able to deliver on time because we realized that it was much bigger enterprise. So we're going to have to wait until Pablo has a new special edition to give it to him and say sorry, because we didn't make it on time, but it was a lot of information, too much data that we were accumulating that. So a little bit of the idea of that we're looking at is all this, and we've been doing ethnographic research with all of this organization. Actually, there are 3 from Venezuela which are not there, but they were also looking at Efecto Cocuy and El Pitazo. I was talking yesterday to the people in El Pitazo, and some of the ones you can see. Normally, these organizations have, and I'll talk a little bit about the ethnographic element of these organizations. These news organizations normally have one old journalist who's very experienced. No, I shouldn't say old, but you know what I mean. I mean somebody who is very experienced, who have years of experience working in the traditional media and the legacy media, and then he or she has a group of journalists who are much younger, and they're all over the region. One thing in common is that they all were created at least with foreign aid. We have looked at different countries. El Salvador, we had published with Silvia Olmedo, a colleague from Spain, also an article of research about that. And there's this was an incipient area years ago in which people really weren't looking at how foreign aid shaped journalism, because the assumption was is the CIA telling the journalism, what to do? And we know it's far more complex than that. It's not that, actually. As we published in a previous article in the journal, it's not that simple to say those things. And also the foreign aid, either it's not new, and I always cite the case that the first newspaper that Simón Bolívar established in Venezuela, in the first non-royalist newspaper, which was El Correo del Orinoco, was established with money, with foreign aid from the Haitian black government. The first black republic gave Bolívar 6,000 men, money, and a print to do the newspapers and to change the agenda in favor of abolition, which Bolívar didn't do at the end, but that's another story to comment. So that they have a particular feature and a particular characteristics. We looked at several accounts, but 2 that I'm going to cite today are IDL's reporters in Peru and Cyprus. Cyprus has been extremely successful to the point that it was now operates more like as a private enterprise than an NGO, like non-profit organization, but in a way, not also. And also some of the numbers. I mean, we're talking now big numbers. These organizations, which only started a couple of years ago, now have over 500,000 visitors, 500,000 followers, and are huge influencers. If you want to use really the word influencers, rather than these kids who use a nice shirt and try to sell it, you can see this as a big influencer. And I think in journalism studies, we really have to appropriate the term influencer and redimension that to what it really means in society to be an influencer. which, okay, I know people in cultural studies are going to hate me for saying this, but I do think that this term of influencer needs to be rethought, at least in journalism studies, to be more political in many sense. And again, I'm apologies in advance for my colleagues in cultural studies who probably do not agree with me at that point. And we do that cloud. Like cloud is no longer, you can't do cloud anymore, but we did it on the time that we could still do cloud. And this was a little bit of ideas of influencer scores in different organizations. You can see how remarkable the growth and the penetration of these organizations were done. And the story here is that many of these organizations started, for example, in Facebook. And for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to have time to explain, but for a variety of reasons, these organizations transfer their efforts to Twitter and now to some of them to Instagram. And because of that, they have a growth massively in terms of the social media penetration, okay? And in Latin America in general, is a very rich and dynamic region. I'm not going to read about this a lot, but you can imagine that the region in itself as users and engagement with social media is very dynamic, and that has created the possibility. So that's the other very interesting point that I would want to say, why is this important? Why are we looking at particularly at this issue of the penetration and visibility of digital media, of the digital native? Well, first of all, because it tells us a lot about contested spaces in the Global South. And that's something that is very absent in the current literature, in academic literature. People don't talk about contested spaces, particularly about the contested spaces in the Global South. There's a lot of good work there. Our colleague Silvio Weisbord and Maria Soledad has published last year a fantastic book about civil society and the media in Latin America, which I strongly recommend, very good book. But apart from a few scattered work, we don't talk enough about these contested media spaces. The other thing is, of course, that the case of these digital natives in Latin America inform us about the future of journalism. Everybody is talking about sustainable models, alternative models, new models of journalism. And of course, this is a very neoliberal thinking in the North, in the US and Europe, in which how can we keep these people going forever? Well, guess what? In Latin America, we don't care. As long as we do good journalism, if tomorrow we don't have the money, we'll do something else and we'll reinvent ourselves in as many times as needed. So I think by looking at other cases in the Global South, I think the North can learn a lot about, do not worry so much about the financial sustainability in neoliberal terms. How can we make money? But also worry about how can we make good journalism instead. And I think that changes a lot of the terms of the questions. And I'm not being naive or romantic. I was news editor. I know a lot about making us a newspaper sustainable in times of crisis. But what I'm saying is that I think we need to ask other questions other than how to make this sustainable. And thirdly, and this is, I think, it's a very interesting point. And we have increasingly become engaged, at least in Jose Luis and I, with infrastructure studies. Because, this research that we're doing, it tells us a lot about how social media relates to public discourses, how media platforms make us rethink assumptions regarding underlying technologies. And our research explores how people organize, fight, and work together on projects which technology plays a central element. And this is, by definition, the field of infrastructure studies. So what we're looking at is how this infrastructure has facilitated and contextualized these new emerging practices in journalism. Okay, I'm going to go through some numbers, and I just spend all day teaching statistics for journalists here, so that's something that I teach here. So more numbers from me today, but I'm just not going to go very thorough quickly on this. But some of the things that we find is you can see the remarkable change. This is in total, in average, how most of the digital native that we explore have basically not abandoned completely Facebook, but have definitely shifted all the efforts and their presence to Twitter. How Twitter brought huge numbers of followers to them, and this is how for example, in the case of their Faro, the distribution of their projection. This is La Silla Vacía, another of the cases that we look at. And again, you can see here as a little bit more distributed. They have associations with other media, but you can see how, and a little bit about the Twitter reach, of each one. But one of the things that you will see here, and I want to make emphasis on this particular graphic, although it's from 2017, it has not changed. We're updating that numbers now, but you can see, we're talking about El Mercurio, El Comercio, two of the most powerful, influential, historically grounded, with one of the most strongest brands in the news. And you can see the huge change between the 2013 to 2017. In 5 years, the native digitals with far less resources and far less history and brand has basically become to dominate the Twitter sphere, and that's a huge change. It's an earthquake for the traditional media, and no wonder that some of these traditional media have now gone trying to buy some of the digital native, and in a way, some of the digital native have become some sort of like startup companies in this realm. Okay, so I wanted to share that number. These are other numbers that I'm not going to go through in details because I realize the time, and I think the most interesting part of this talk is going to be the answers and questions, the questions and answers. But this is a little bit of how the type of subjects that IDL mentions, and it's very interesting because for the first time, the new infrastructure that journalists use allows them to guide their agenda by metrics. That didn't happen in the past, trust me. When I was an editor of newspaper, we decided the story in my desk, and that was it, no discussion. I knew what people wanted to know, and that was our argument. Yeah, when there was no argument, I would tell journalists, this is the story of today, you follow it, and that's it. Not that I was autocratic. I was a little, although you ask my wife, she says that I am, but that's another story. In any case, what today journalists needs this metric to look at, and because they follow it, that's one of the reasons we found in the interviews, in the semi-structured interviews, one of the reasons that we found that they are successful in projecting and in projecting themselves publicly is because they have their ear on the ground with regards to the metrics. They know what people want to hear about, what was the stories that they follow, without this becoming the traditional tendency that we used to have in the old media and the traditional media, which is, oh, let's put more entertainment so we increase the numbers of readers or the numbers of listeners. No. This is looking at the stories themselves, the news stories themselves, what are they? And here you have an example of how infrastructure defines now the agenda. And not only for the organization itself that is performing the task, but also for the overall media ecology. Because once IDL dominates in the Twitter sphere, the other media will have to follow that story. And in that sense, I think they're being very, very successful. It's also brings some different issues. And I'm part of the IMCR group that partly looks at foreign aid. And when you look at the donors, you see that the donors in the past used to have certain mechanism to evaluate media to which they destine money. And that is changing, and it's changing because of this, because the old criteria that you had is no longer applicable in this new media ecology. So you can also see how, in the case of CIPER in Chile, you can also see how the investigations highlight certain, obviously Piñera being the president, but also you can see other politicians there, okay? And you can see it in the area, the case of the different stories and what are the stories that are bringing part. Interesting enough, as you can see, Lava Jato is the main story there, but Overage coming second. Overage is the Brazilian company that bribed literally everybody in Latin America, but you can see it there, and also you can see here the type of stories that come out. But I'm not going to make too much things there. I'm just going to show some of the numbers that are going to come in our piece, hopefully when it comes out. But you can see some of the type of stories and how these metrics define what the journalists do. This is the story of Alan Garcia and Fujimori. Garcia is the former president of Peru who committed suicide, and many accused Gustavo Gorriti of being responsible because he brought all these charges against him, and there was a whole thing about that. And well, anyway, that's part of that story. So in conclusion, what we know is that digital natives continue to have a limited reach in general, but they have a much more full impact in the agenda setting. So even though there's not a lot of people who actually read the stories of the digital media, there's a lot of people who follow them in Twitter and social media, etc. There's a need to adapt, and they have transitioned from Facebook to Twitter. And that has a fundamental impact. And what I want to mention is the term asymmetrics. And Valeria was very kind to remind me that my master's degree in Lancaster University, UK, was in defense and security studies, because I never planned to become an academic. I was supposed to go back and work as a war correspondent, which is what I wanted to do after doing my master's. But you know, John Lennon says that life is what happens when you're planning something. Life is what happens when you're planning something else. But the term of asymmetry, which is a military term, applies here, because basically what the native digital had to endure over the past few years was an asymmetric a confrontation with the traditional media in every sense, not only in terms of the resources, but also in terms of the legacy. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be here. But also, I think there's something, to me, the main interesting lesson is something that actually somebody already said, and it was the late Jim Hall, who wrote what is to me still the best work 20 years ago, the best book in online journalism in my view. And he said, Jim Hall said, the journalist's ability to present a cogent argument around a limited range of facts is less important than the skills needed to create a rich and productive information environment. And I think that is absolutely true. And I think what is applicable, of course, today is that information environment is based on the social media, and that's where the journalists and the new battlefield for the journalists, and let me use that term, of the journalists from the native digital is happening, not only in terms of competing the old legacy media, but also confronting censorship and other issues that we confront at the moment in Latin America. Thank you, and I'll leave questions and answer.
Thank you so much, Jairo. Valerie will moderate the questions coming in from the audience. I invite everybody to input them in the Q&A chat. But let me just while people add their questions, Jairo, let me ask you one myself, if you don't mind. And yes, you still owe us that paper. Hopefully, we'll put together another special issue, and you'll be able to submit that, but that's not what the question is about. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about some general trends in the region that might have influenced some of your findings. Mainstream media organizations in Latin America have suffered from a significant crisis of credibility over the past several years, decades actually. So I was wondering whether you think, what role do you assign to these somewhat, high levels of distrust in mainstream media, in order to propel the non-profits that you're describing about to a sort of center stage in terms of setting the agenda digitally and in politics overall?
Thank you, Pablo. It's another conference not altogether. That's a fantastic question. I always say to friends in the US that if the US had the media that Latin America had, even the worst one, it would be better prepared to confront Trump, Donald Trump. Because trust in the media in Latin America, and this I say properly, I mean, we work, for example, Javier Javier is a colleague in Tarragona, and I work on a paper we published on the El Mercurio. And the interesting thing is that when we interview people of the time of the 1970s about Mercurio, they all said the same thing. They didn't believe what the Mercurio said. Nobody believed what El Mercurio even says today. And it never had believed it. You know, my hometown Panorama was the main newspaper. Nobody believed what Panorama said, but everybody read it and bought it. The media, what I'm saying is the news media in Latin America has always had a problem of credibility. But the fact that you're credible or not doesn't mean that you are influential or not. And this is something that is very different from the US. In the US, if you didn't have credibility, or in the UK, for example, where I lived in the past 20 years before coming to Doha, if you didn't have credibility, and that's why people, for example, said, okay, I'm gonna wait until the BBC says it, then I know it's true. Latin America, nobody said the truth, so it doesn't matter who you read. But you still bought the newspaper. That was very influential. And what happened now for this media is that these digital natives are competing better than the old media, not because they have more trust, but because they're saying different things. They're presenting a different agenda. And because they're presenting a different agenda, what in Latin America we normally call agenda propia, our own agenda, that's the term that we journalists used to use. And I remember when I was a newsroom, we always said, oh, we need an agenda propia, we need our own agenda. But when the day-to-day came and somebody scoop us in from another newspaper, the owner will run back and say, why don't we have this story? But we said we wanted to cover different things. No, we need that story. So now I think one of the great things about this native digital, and this is something that people like Cesar Batiz in the Pitazo keeps telling me, he's the director of El Pitazo in Caracas. He used to work with the leading newspaper in Venezuela, the Últimas Noticias, in terms of circulation. And Cesar says, no, I'm more happy here. I'm happier here, Jairo, because I'm independent. I can actually write the stories I think are important for people. I'm not worried about ratings. I'm not worried about circulation. I'm just worried about what's the best story. And I think that's, people start recognizing that, you know. Journalism is a very magical process in which, you know, we get all these metrics, and these are important metrics that we have, but at the same time, it's a bit of an art. And I think what these organizations have allowed these journalists is to practice more their art rather than just their profession.
Great. And building off, Jairo, on what you just were talking about the digital natives, there's a question from the audience. They're asking, do you think that the digital Latin natives in the US are different consumers of media than those in Latin America?
Yes, absolutely yes, because it's a completely different media ecology. You know, the media in the US has a long history of independence and a long history of also corporate ownership. And Latin America has a long history of corporate and government ownership and not a lot of history of independence. And when I say independence, it's not only independence from governments and corporations, also independence to set your own agenda. And I think that is one of the things that digital media, the digital native brings to the game that we didn't really have. That infrastructure of that in the media, a media ecology that is fundamentally digital into a way interactive, allows a new type of independence that we didn't really enjoy in the past. And I'm not even talking about the dictatorships period. I'm talking about even in the 1980s onwards.
Thank you for your answer. And also in your presentation, you said that journalists should worry more about doing good journalism instead of worrying about sustainability. And how is this possible in your opinion?
Well, that's one of the, I'm saying, what I try to say is that's the lesson in Latin America. It's not necessarily applicable to all parts. But one of the things that really worries me is that these discussions about journalism in the digital area are discussions that when you hear them in the United States or Europe are almost concentrated on how can we sustain this? How can this be viable? And to me, that's a very neoliberal approach. And I'm not being romantic at all. If anybody's very entrepreneurial, is myself. But what I'm saying is, what should be part of the discussion is how can we do good journalism, and then think backwards, do inverse engineering. Think first what type of good journalism you want to do, and then think how you can sustain that, rather than the other way around. That how can we sustain something so we can do journalism? I think the question has to be thought the other way around.
Yeah, thank you. And then could you expand on your point about there being no investigative journalism in Latin America without foreign aid? So does this mean that online native investigative specific news organizations, or does it include investigative journalism done also by traditional news organizations? And if that aid is direct financial aid, does it include things like technical support, training, among other things?
Absolutely. I mean, when I left Venezuela in my last job as a full-time journalist, we had an investigative unit that had just been closed down in the newspaper I was in, because of budgetary cuts. El Universal, which is one of the main newspapers in Caracas, closed a year after, closed the investigative unit. Even in the UK, the Inside unit, which was the Times newspaper unit, was closed around also the late 1990s. Peter Honun was the head of Inside, I think I remember. So there was no investigative journalism, because investigative journalism, I mean, I know the credo is, they say all journalism should be investigative. Yeah, try to say that to somebody who's writing 5 or 6 stories in one day with a deadline. I mean, I always laugh. I arrived in the UK and I went to the Daily Mirror, which was a newspaper which was roughly the same size than the newspaper I was directing. And they had 224 journalists, and they were worried because they just were making cuts of 10% of the journalists. I had 25 journalists for the same newspapers in Venezuela. So, I know all this, I know all these stories, but the truth is that a lot of real in-depth good investigative journalism takes time and takes resources. And you cannot do that unless you are the Washington Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, but you can't do that if you're the Westmoreland Gazette in Cumbria in the UK. And you can't do that if you are Guaireño in Vargas in Venezuela. So a lot of the good investigative journalism, as I said, the Lavajato case, the Panama Papers, not only some of them, the most important investigative work in journalism in the past few years have been done by organizations that one way or the other have received foreign aid. Now, the term foreign aid, it's a very complex term, as I discuss in my book. It's not straightforward. CIA giving money to somebody, or USAID giving money to somebody. It's far more complex. I cited the case of the Haitian government during the Haitian Revolution, after the Haitian Revolution, who gave money to Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar would not have been able to do the Second Republic and a newspaper without the support of the Haitians and the British after that. That's why the newspaper went from, one political side to the other. But so yes, I don't think today a lot of the good investigative journalism could happen and without foreign aid. And it's funny because people immediately associate foreign aid to interference from foreign governments, but it's not that the case. For example, we did our research, in-depth research, and we found, better, I'm going to give an example. Several of the organizations of the Panama Papers who were implicated and exposed by the Panama paper as holding tax haven money in the bank in Panama, were donors of the organizations that exposed this story. So that you can't have it, a better case of magic realism in Latin America cannot be deployed. The same people who exposed these wrongdoings in Panama, in the Panama paper, were receiving money from some of the organizations they exposed. So that's, and some of the most liberal left-wing investigative journalism happening in Latin America is funded by the Konrad Adenauer organization, and this is some of the most brilliant journalism happening, Konrad Adenauer, the Konrad Adenauer, that's social Christian right-wing thing, and they do fantastic journalism. So it's a very, very complex situation there.
Yeah, for sure. And then do you think this foreign financing to local media in Latin America is still perceived the same way, with the same idea of skepticism around this kind of funding? Or do you think this is getting better as stories like the ones you mentioned emerge?
Well, it doesn't really matter how people perceive it. What it matters is that it's used by many governments. At least, for example, in the case of Venezuela, was used by the Venezuelan government to accuse organizations that were doing investigative journalism. For example, there's a lawyer who is a Chavista lawyer called Eva Gollinger, and she did a terrible job. She not only accused, she did a McCarthyist witch hunt against journalists because they were receiving even training. It was just training, like how to use computers or something, and then they will use this against these people, against the journalists. So it doesn't really, it's probably relevant because, well, as I said to Pablo in his question, trust is not really an issue in the region. It's influence. And what it matters here, what it really makes damage is the way governments use the recipient of foreign aid to attack the journalist.
Okay, and taking into account the interactivity of digital media, what influence do audiences have on the construction of the agenda? And could you suggest any good practices to refer to?
Okay, first of all, let me say hello to Raiza Rivera. She was my professor at the university. She's very young, believe it or not. She was very young when she taught me, but my professor, hello Raiza, nice to see you here. I think still they're lagging behind. The digital natives do not have that influence among the general public. They're not consumed by that many people. So, if you say Torbes in Peru, which is the biggest selling newspaper in the world, I think nowadays it's something like over 500,000 or 600,000 copies a day. They're far more influential in terms of the audiences they reach. But what the influence of digital native has to be seen more as the influence of the agenda on setting what the people, as Berson put it once, the media is not good at telling people what to think, but it's excellent at telling what to think about. And this is where the role of digital media is very, very effective in telling people what to think about. And it's great to me because most of this digital media is true journalism, is progressive agendas, are agendas that are anti-corruption, more better wealth distribution. And I think they're doing a great job in general.
Great. And another question from the audience, it says, are the digital native media workers not generally concerned about working conditions? Are they really only driven by the passion of information?
Thank you, Veronica, for that question. It's an excellent question. Well, actually, when I said that we shouldn't be concerned about the sustainability, I meant that we're also going to we'll look somehow, because in Spanish, we have this term says, don't worry, no te preocupes, yo resuelvo. Don't worry, I will solve something, resuelve. And so what I meant is that we will look for formulas to keep these things going, even if the foreign aid is cut. And it's being cut at the moment because of the coronavirus crisis and the impact it had some organizations. However, this normally in these organizations, and this is something we published in a previous paper, Jose Requejo Alemán and myself, we found that the working conditions of the journalists working in this organization is much better. Gustavo Gorriti has a much salary now that he ever had before when he worked in big newspapers. Because you can set the structure of cost straight away. you don't depend if the revenue, you're not dependent on the advertising revenue as much. And they have much better working conditions. Some of those organizations work together with universities or other institutions in the region, and normally that means they have better conditions. So for the ethnographic research that we did, what we found is, and this was a key question that we asked, is about salaries and working conditions. We find that a lot of these organizations, in the past, when I was a journalist back in the 90s, what everybody dreamt was to go through different stages on the television, radio, or newspapers, become some sort of editor, and then move to a news agency like Associated Press or Reuters, because it's where you would earn more than ever you were earning before. And with these news organizations, you can reach that type of salaries, which is because it comes from foreign aid, is normally dollarized and pegged to the dollar. And that means that your salary stays and you can plan better as a journalism. So even if you have a contract of 3 or 4 years, it's probably better than having a 6 or 7 year contract in a traditional newspaper. So if anything, that's one of the reasons some of the best journalists have migrated from the traditional media into this new, and set up this new media. And I was citing, Cesar, Batiste, but I can cite others, many others. Gender is also very important. It's a very important thing in terms of working conditions. When I was working, there were very few women editors, very few editors. In fact, in the UK, in Britain, liberal Britain, there's only one woman, which is Independent on Sunday. There's no other, I think, and now the woman from The Guardian, but until recently there were no women. If you look at the composition of the hierarchy structure on this organization, you'll find that a lot of women are occupying places or editorial places.
Thank you. And then transitioning to what you talked about in social media, we have a question from Mora, and she's asking, why do you think that there has been a transition from Facebook to Twitter for these organizations?
Because Twitter has been far more effective for them to project themselves. Twitter tends to be more political, short. So the nature of journalism, which is the nature of headlines, that's the nature of journalism, headlines. You capture the attention by the headlines. You sold newspapers because you had good headlines, and works very well in Twitter. It doesn't work that well in Facebook. So the nature of journalism itself, which is if you follow Michael Schulzen, as I do follow his concept that journalism is a political institution, therefore it's more adapted to a political social media as Twitter rather than Facebook. That is not, tends to be, you tend to have politics there, but it's not, you have also less authorial control in Facebook. In Twitter, you have far more authorial control. So you manage that soundbite in the headline that you can give, that you can't give that. And there's many other reasons there also, which we point out in the paper. Facebook also had a different, at the time, had a different editorial policy, and blanked some of the, for example, some of the native digitals in Bolivia got themselves in trouble, and they lost a lot of these followers because Facebook suddenly, a couple of years ago imposed certain conditions. That's a well-known case. Twitter can ban you. They can just tell you that your message or your tweet is not convenient or something, or they can just ban it, but doesn't have the degree of authorial control that Facebook has.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jairo. We are finished perfectly on time. Thank you so much for a great presentation, terrific Q&A. Thank you, Valerie, for outstanding moderation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I want to invite people to join us again next week, where we're going to go from Venezuela and Doha to Costa Rica. Ignacio Siles from Universidad de Costa Rica will talk to us about his work at the weekly seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Hope everybody has a great rest of your weeks, and see you here again on Tuesday. Bye now.